I normally end my solo videos with a series of questions for the audience, but today I thought that I would start my solo video with a series of questions for the audience. First off, do you remember where you were when you found out that Bernie Sanders was going to be running for president again? And do you remember what your reaction was? I was sitting at home, I had just woken up to the news, and I remember my reaction clearly. My reaction went like this, and I quote, "Oh my God. Yes, yes. This is actually happening again. I get to watch this again. Oh my God, there is a God. Yes, yes. Oh my God, yes, yes." End quote. As I talk about Bernie Sanders both in this video and as we go along with the campaign trail, I'm not going to be hitting many of the major talking points that many people in the mainstream and alternative media and on social media as well like to point out while they're talking about Bernie Sanders. I understand the fact that he was thrown out of a hippie commune in the 70s for being too lazy. I understand the fact that he sang shirtless in the Soviet Union sometime in the 80s. I understand that he had his honeymoon in the Soviet Union in the 80s. That's all well and good, and that's documented fact, but we don't accept, or don't want to accept anyway, the things that are written in yearbooks, and we don't hold people to account to what they did 30 years ago anymore, and I'm going to extend Bernie Sanders the same courtesy. I'm going to be focusing more on things that he did in 2016, immediately leading up to 2016, and in the time frame between 2016 and now. This past week, Bernie Sanders announced that he is again going to be seeking the presidency in 2020. This will be his second run as a Democrat, in spite of the fact that he runs as an independent when he goes for his Senate races. And there are some other issues, of course, that go along with this. As of the inauguration, Bernie Sanders is going to be 79 years old and would be one of the oldest presidential candidates in all of history. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the video, but he will also be facing very fierce opposition from both sides as he makes his way through the primary season and decides what he's going to do as he goes along. There's no way of lying and saying that Sanders doesn't have a very dedicated fan base, because those who do support him for the presidency are very dedicated to his cause. That was shown this past week when in the first 48 hours when he made it official that he was going to be running for the president, he raised over $6 million. In the past election in 2016, while Hillary was running against Donald Trump, it was reported that there were at least 100,000 people across the country that wrote in Bernie Sanders, but I feel like there's a lot more from watching social media, and there's really no way of recording how many people actually voted for Bernie in 2016, as records for write-ins are not kept as carefully as records for mainstream and official party candidates. In spite of his dedicated fan base, Bernie Sanders does face a very uphill battle as he seeks the presidency for 2020. In 2016, the majority of the people who tried to run for the presidency were considered to be neoliberal, very center-left, very business-friendly, and very union-friendly, and Sanders was able to run far to the left of them and gain a lot of momentum among younger voters, especially college age, and people who were left behind by the economy as it was in 2016. Due to his popularity, the Democrat Party was forced to move left to correct for the fact that he was in the race, to try and gain traction against many of these young voters again, especially since many more Democrat socialists were coming out of the woodwork and trying to make their place in government. Mainstream candidates who had been dreaming of the presidency since they started getting into politics realized that they were going to have to pander to this base in order to keep any traction and get any of their dreams to come true as they sought the presidency in years to come. In the past 2 years, a single-payer healthcare system coined by Bernie Sanders as Medicare for All has become a mainstream party plank for the Democrat Party. This was something that was unheard of while Clinton was running for president and even as his successors were trying to take out George W. Bush. We've also seen every mainstream candidate now start pushing for a very high minimum wage, no matter what it would do to the economy. And the structures for funding college and the structures for taxes in general, trying to make sure that everybody has an equality of outcome, have all become major planks of the Democrat Party. Many of these issues have become so embedded and so ingrained in the DNC that many center candidates who would have been easily a challenge for Clinton back when he was running, or against Gore or everybody else who has run for the Democrat Party since then, are now forced to run as an independent, and Howard Schultz is a great example of this. And while much of what I've pointed out here in the last couple of minutes seems to be in line with things that are being said over on Fox News, and especially things that are being said by many alternative media figures who also stand opposed to Bernie Sanders becoming the nominee, if you look over at the article I've linked below from CNN, you will see that even CNN is citing many of these issues that Bernie is going to have, trying to oppose the mainstream candidates from the Democrat Party as he seeks 2020. To take it one step further, as of right now, Bernie Sanders is still registered in the Senate as an independent, and according to The Hill, the DNC does have a rule that they coined shortly after Bernie Sanders tried to run for president and took the steam out of a mainstream candidate that does require all of the people who run for the DNC to run registered as a Democrat and be in the Democrat Party. This may cause an issue for Sanders as he goes along because, as I said, he has not changed his party affiliation yet. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, Bernie Sanders is 77 years old. The average age of death for a man in the United States is 75 right now, and while my 80-year-old grandmother would tell you that averages don't mean crap and people do have to live longer than the averages in order to make them averages, statistically Bernie Sanders is running on borrowed time right now. And in reality, like I mentioned on the podcast when I talked to Wyatt, the same thing with Joe Biden. If Bernie Sanders does get the nomination, a lot of his race is going to come down to who he chooses as a running mate and what his running mate's record in Congress and his agenda might be. In addition to the opposition that Sanders faces from within his own party at this point, conservatives on social media and alternative media figures have begun to pull out stops against Bernie that they would not have normally pulled out this early in the race. There are the talks of the things that I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the fact that he was kicked out of a hippie commune in the 70s for being too lazy. There are talks about the fact that he was writing violent rape poems while he was in the hippie commune. Of course, we can't forget about the fact that he went to honeymoon in the Soviet Union and considered communism to be the be-all, end-all force that was going to save the world. Now, some of this might be plants from the DNC. We saw a little bit of this talked about when Ralph Northam's yearbook photo suddenly showed up. But for the most part, it's conservatives who are spreading this around social media, trying to discredit Sanders as a viable 2020 presidential candidate. I feel there are a lot of people who might disagree with me, especially this early on in the race, but I feel it needs to be said. We need to lay off of Bernie Sanders and let all of this run his course. There's very little chance that Sanders really does stand a chance to defeat Donald Trump in 2020. But for the most part, Sanders can run against everybody else in the primaries, and he tends to bring out the worst in people as he's running against them in primary elections. We saw this in 2016. While Sanders turned around and endorsed Hillary after the primaries were over, and that may be the biggest bar that he has to clear in order to win the presidency in 2020, we can't argue the fact that Sanders and his camp were able to find a lot of very good Oppo research on Hillary Clinton and release it, even more than any of the Republicans were able to do against her. And he did bring out the worst in her, and he forced her to move further left to try and match him because she was losing support among his faithful base. Because of Sanders, we realized that Clinton was going to do anything to become president, including lie about her positions, in order to get to that fabled Oval Office. And with all of that in mind, I am okay with letting Sanders run and bring out the Oppo research and force the Democrats to stand by their positions or move to the left to try and get to his level. I'd like to see what comes out about that, and I would like to see what the Democrats bring out against him as primary opponents for the 2020 election. What do you think about the fact that Bernie is running for president again? Do you think he can get any traction, and do you think he can overcome the hurdle of endorsing Hillary Clinton for 2016? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlog Twitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care.
You're